This sermon was from the series Malachi, A Call to Return Home. It was preached at Crossway Church in Battleground, Washington. We hope you enjoy it. Around Thanksgiving a few years ago, radio commentator Paul Harvey shared a true story of a woman and her frozen Thanksgiving turkey. I guess the Butterball Turkey Company set up a telephone hotline to answer any questions people have about preparing the holiday turkeys. I don't know if you know, the first time I've ever cooked a frozen turkey, I was shocked at all the work that it took. But one woman called to inquire about cooking a turkey that had been in the bottom of their freezer, she said, for 23 years. You heard me right, 23 years. Now, the Butterball representative told her that the turkey would probably be safe to eat if the freezer had been kept below zero for the entire 23 years. But they also warned her that even if the turkey was safe to eat, the flavor would probably have deteriorated in such a degree that she would not recommend eating it. And I guess her response was, "That's what I thought. We'll give the turkey to our church." I begin my sermon this morning with that because I think that attitude kind of describes what we've seen has been taking place throughout Malachi. The people who were going through the motions of just literally bringing the sacrifices that they were supposed to bring in the Old Testament were bringing maimed animals that were maimed by wild animals. They were bringing their disease, their sick, their everything. And instead of giving their best, they gave their worst, or at least their second best at that. And we will see that this kind of attitude towards being stingy towards God continues in our text today. And so if you want to turn with me, we should have about 2 more weeks in Malachi after this text, after this sermon today. Then we'll probably look at a couple of, I'll probably finish up 3 John just because I want to finish off that trilogy and it's a one-off. And then when I get back from a vacation, we'll start a new sermon series. I'll plug in a couple sermons in between there too. But again, we are in Malachi 3, 6 through 12. And again, Malachi is written to the people of Israel who are back, who came back. They were in exile, and God provided them a way for them to come back and to repopulate the nation of Israel. They built a new temple, and they were looking forward to God working and for them to have political freedom, to have power, to have wealth. And it's been over 70 to 100 years after that took place, and things aren't going the way that they are, and they're frustrated, they're angry, and they're wondering, why is it that God is allowing this to happen? And God is challenging them and saying, hey, look, you're going through the motions, but your heart really isn't into it. And he's giving them different things that shows why their heart isn't into it and how it's the symptoms at it. But at its heart, it really is that their heart isn't into their relationship with God, and they're not giving him the priority that he deserves. And so today, he looks at actually their offerings and their gifts. And so Malachi 3, verses 6 through 12, it is this. I, the Lord, do not change, so you, the descendants of Jacob, are not destroyed. Ever since the time of your ancestors, you have turned away from my decrees and have not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord Almighty. But you ask, how are we to return? Will a mere mortal rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, how are we robbing you? In tithes and offerings, you are under a curse, the whole nation, because you're robbing me. Bring me the whole tithe into the storehouse, that we may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out to so much blessing that there will be no room enough to store it. I'll prevent pests from devouring your crops, and the vines in your fields will not destroy their fruit before it's ripe, says the Lord Almighty. Then all the nations will call you blessed, for yours will be a delightful land, says the Lord Almighty. Well, it's a short text, but God doesn't really pull any punches, as he hasn't in the book of Malachi. He literally has been communicating some pretty hard truths. If you've been here, you know that. He doesn't pull any punches. And in the very beginning, he gives an assessment of Malachi's day. The first thing he does, though, is maybe a little bit shocking. Just like he opened the very book in the very beginning with the word of his love and how he reminded the people that he loved them. And it was good for them to remember that because he's going to speak some pretty harsh truths. And so the idea that we have when we look at the book of Malachi is this is a loving parent who loves his kids and wants what's best for them. And he sees that they're making mistakes and they're not following through the way that they should. And so he's calling them back to this. This is the kind of verbiage and the image that we need to have as we look at this text. And again, this time he reminds them of his nature and who he is. In the very beginning, he kind of takes this brief pause in between his challenges to the people to remind them who he is. And that the first one is, he says, I do not change, and so you, the descendants of Jacob, are not destroyed. Now, there's two things that we notice in here. The first one is his immutability. Now, that's just a big word that says God does not change. Well, why is that important? Because what we want to see is that God is always faithful, and that's the point. God is telling his people and reminding them that he has been faithful to his promises that he made from the very beginning, and he will continue to be faithful. And he wants to remind the people of this truth. He doesn't change. And that's good for us to remember too, that the God who speaks to us in the Bible is still the God who speaks to us today. And so it's good for us to remember that. God doesn't change. He is immutable. The second thing he highlights is his grace. I mean, he basically says to them, hey, you are not doing what you are doing. Now, anytime he uses and refers to them as the descendants of Jacob and not the nation of Israel, you know that they aren't exactly doing what they should be. If you know anything about the story of Jacob, Jacob means to be the deceiver. He was a crook. He was a liar. He was a cheat. And he lived that way for years. And then he had an encounter with God, and God changed his name to Israel. And so when God refers to the people of Israel as descendants of Jacob, it usually is reminding them that they're acting like Jacob was before he had that encounter with God. It's not exactly a good thing. But he also reminds them that even though they deserve punishment, which he talked about in the week before, that he was gracious to them. That he has been showing grace, kindness, and mercy to them more than they could ever imagine. And so he reminds them that they have been disobedient from the very beginning. He said, ever since the time of your ancestors, you have turned away from my decrees and have not kept them. Now, I want you to see, God is reminding them that they have been unfaithful, but he has been faithful. They have not kept their end of the bargain. They made a covenant with him before they went into the land and said that they would follow him, and there was blessings and there was curses associated with that. And God has continued to be faithful to them, even though they didn't deserve it. Even they're coming back and being able to create the nation of Israel again as a gift. It shouldn't have happened. But God says, you're unfaithful, you're disobedient, but I have been faithful. But I also want you to see his heart. His heart is not that he can just lambaste them and give them a hard time. No, he wants them to return to him. And so he uses this language. He says, return to me and I will return to you. Sometimes when we view God, we view him as this angry guy who's mad and ticked off at us. And there is a sense that he's holy and he doesn't like sin. But I want you to see that there's a gracious invitation here to the people of Israel to return to him and to come his way despite their rebellion. And he reminds them, hey, you may have been unfaithful, but I am faithful to my word. And if you turn to me, I will return to you. And I will continue to show that kindness, that mercy, that grace. That's how he starts off the text. And then he doesn't pull any punches, and he shows them, again, what's the symptom that their heart really isn't in line with his. And the symptom in this sense is that God's people are withholding what was rightfully his. In my commentary study this week, I found this quote that I thought was interesting. It's from a commentary called Exalting Jesus in Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. I could have listed all three authors, but I figured this was enough right there. 3 different people write each section of the book. But in it says that you can always determine where a person's heart is by evaluating their bank account statements. We may not like to talk about money, but money talks a lot about us. It's a pretty interesting quote if you think about it, but really the point that they're trying to get across is that our bank accounts often show what we like to spend our money on, and especially our discretionary money. The reality is that those things that we really treasure, those things that we really value, it's pretty easy for us to cut a check. And let's be honest, those things that we don't like to. I haven't heard anybody who likes to write a check to the IRS. I don't. I wrote a big one this year. I did it begrudgingly. May have thought about it once or twice. Do I really eat it? But it is that way. But those things that we really want, we have no problem spending our money on. And that's really the point of this text. And in our text, of that quote, in our text, what we see is that Israel's lack of generosity showed the state of their heart. Again, he accuses them of robbing him, and really what he's saying is that they aren't giving the tithe that they were commanded to give. Now, we see that in Nehemiah 13, actually. Nehemiah, who is a leader in Israel in the time of Micah, says that he learned of the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and the musicians responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. So in other words, the way that God designed it is that the Levites could be in the temple, and the way that they could be in the temple is that the people would bring these tithes and the offerings, and that would provide them what they needed. And so that wasn't happening, and so they said, well, I got to provide for myself and my family, and so they went back to their own fields and took care of it, and the work was not being done. And so Nehemiah says, so I rebuked the officials and asked them, why is the house of God neglected? And then he called them together and stationed them at their posts. Now, what we need to look at in this idea of why is this generosity and why is this giving and a spirit of generosity such a big deal, I think we have to go back to the very beginning and the idea that God is the creator and ruler and giver of everything. You know, it's interesting that King David, when he was collecting money to build the temple, prayed a prayer as he was asking the people for the funds. And in it, he declares that God is the creator of everything, that he's from everlasting to everlasting, that his greatness and his power and his majesty and splendor of all of heaven is yours. And then he says, wealth and honor come from you. You are the ruler of all things. And I think it's a good reminder for us that because sometimes we can get so focused on ourselves and the things that we do and our needs and our wants and just finances in general, that we have to step back a little bit and remind ourselves that God is the creator and the ruler and the giver of everything we have. Now, sometimes we have this attitude, well, yeah, but I put this work, I did this, I pulled myself up from the bootstraps. I think that's a very American concept to begin with. But we need to remind ourselves that everything we have is a gift from God. James 1 says that every good and perfect gift from above is coming down from the Father of heavenly lights. And if you think about it, there's all kinds of things outside of our control that allow us to have the things that we have. God had us be born into the family that we were born into. God had us give us with the skill set and in the time and the place that we have for us to succeed. He gave us all of those things. And so, yes, we play our role in it, but ultimately, God is the giver of everything. And we need to remind ourselves of that because sometimes we can become so inward focused, at least I can, that we kind of forget that everything is a gift from God. But if we have that perspective, then it's easy for us to remind ourselves that we are stewards and not owners. There's two ways that we can come at things in life. We can look at the things that we've been given and say, these are ours to take care of for the time being, but ultimately they aren't ours. Everything is a gift. Or we can say, it's mine and I can do whatever I want. One is an open-handed view of things, and the other is a closed-handed things. Now, having things and having money is not a bad thing. And quite frankly, I think sometimes God blesses people so that they can help further his kingdom. I was talking to somebody, and they were talking about all the charities that they were a part of, and they were a believer, and it was deep in them. And they made a comment in kind of a side way of, God, we have a lot of money, and they kind of said it sheepishly, and it's like, it sounds like to me that God's actually blessed you so that you can do all these good things. Again, it's that mindset of being stewards and not owners, and we need to have that. That's why in Leviticus 27, he says, a tithe of everything from the land, whether grain of soil or fruit, belongs to the Lord. And 1 Peter talks about it in this kind of way. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. So I want you to think about this. Everything you have, all the talents, all the gifts, all the things that you own are all gracious gifts that God has given you. That's a pretty big statement. But that's exactly what the Bible declares. And giving reminds us of that we don't hold it tightly, but rather we need to hold it open-handed, and we need to have that kind of perspective. One pastor I read said, if somebody came to you and said, I'm going to give you this huge house, and I'm going to give you it for free, but there's one condition. I need 1/10 of it, one out of those 10 rooms that I need to have access to and be able to do whatever I need to do as you come and go. I think most of us would probably take that deal. Free house, hands-free, but there's a little bit that has to be given. And in that sense, that's kind of what giving is. Giving reminds us that we're stewards, that God has given us this great gift, and now we can't do whatever we want with it, but rather we give as he's called us to do. And one of the ways I would say that we can actually recognize whether or not God has as much control over our lives as we think is what we do with our time and what we do with our gifts. And that is the ultimate thing. When we allow him to even control all of those things, well, then we know that he's gotten our heart. And we'll see in the New Testament when we look at it that there's always this call of what are we putting our treasure in? What are we investing in? And the challenge is that we want to invest in the things that matter, not just in not the things that are going to let us down. And an investment in God and an investment in his things are going to challenge us because it's going to require sacrifice. But it also reminds us that God is the giver of everything, and it reminds us that he has given us gifts. Now, I want to go through this because the purpose of the Old Testament tithes and offerings, and I think it's important for us to note that he mentions both of these, the tithes and offering. Tithes just means a tenth of anything, and that is the kind of the way that it was set up, but there was also offerings on top of that. Now, there were a couple of things that we see in the New Testament that they were called to do. The first one I mentioned already is to support the ministry of the priests and the Levites. They were the temple workers and to help the temple be working, and so they could do that. But also, the giving that they gave to the temple, the money that was put in the temple storehouse that's described here, was to provide for the needs of the poor and the vulnerable. And so we see it in Deuteronomy 14, that at the end of every year brings all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns so that they may take care of the foreigners, the fatherless, the widows who live in there. And so it was both of those things. It wasn't just to do the ministry of the church, but rather it was also to help people. That's one of the reasons why we have a benevolence fund, so we can help people in the church. We don't talk about it much, but there are families that we help on a continual basis when needs arise, or people from out in the community sometimes. And that is part of the work of the church. And even if you give to other organizations outside of the church and you give some of what you do and your generosity that way, I encourage you to think about those things that are on mission for God, either that spread the gospel or that help take care of the poor and the vulnerable, whether it's adopting a child through Compassion International or an organization like that, whether it's helping the food bank or helping those who are in low income and have mental health needs. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways that you can be charitable in giving. But I would say as we look at those things that we give and we invest in, that those are the two things, the church and organizations that kind of fit in that. Now, what we see is that the people of God were hard-hearted. They were going through the motions, but in reality, they were not exactly caring about God at all. They were just doing what I said, going through the motions. And as we see in this text, what God says is part of the reasons why they're going through the motions is that they were giving their worst animals for their sacrifice, or they weren't even giving at all. And God gives them this challenge. He reminds them that way back in Deuteronomy, they had made a promise, the people of Israel, that they would follow God. And if they would follow God and be his people, that there would be covenantal blessings and there would be covenantal curses. And if they didn't follow through, that God had the right to do this. And God is saying, like, one of the reasons why you're going through all this, I'm withholding my covenantal blessings. He uses this language of a curse, but really it's I'm trying to get your attention so that you turn to me. And so things weren't going the way that the people expected them to. And we don't know what all the details are of what was happening, but we see that God is trying to get their attention and say, hey, I need you to do this. And so we see that he challenges them to resume their faithful giving. He says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. Now, the storehouse is the room where all the food would be brought and all the things that would be brought there that they could use to give to the poor, that they could use to take care of the priests and the Levites and use to have all the expenses. He says, bring that full tithe. And he promises to bless their obedience by protecting their crops. Now, this is a very specific promise to a very specific time. And I have heard this preached that, if you give a tenth, then God will provide you and he'll give you a blessing and a financial blessing and you just need to sow it. I think that's an overreaction to this text. God is telling them right here. But I do think that he assures them that he will provide for them and he will bless them. And sometimes that blessing isn't always financial. Sometimes it's in other ways. And I think we need to be careful that we don't think that if we just give, God will bless us financially. Sometimes I think he does because we have our priorities in the spot, right, and our hearts in the right spot. And that has a domino effect. But he definitely says that the others around them will witness his provision and favor. That's one of the things that the people of Israel have always been called to do, that they live differently than the world around them, that the world would notice it and take notice. So how does this text, apply to us? We don't have a temple. We don't have a shed out there, but it's not a storehouse for you to bring a bunch of grain. We do take an offering, and we'll talk about that. But what is it? Well, I think the text should encourage us that we need to be faithful in our giving. That generosity shouldn't be a mark of a Christian. And that we need to not hold our things tightly, but rather we have an open hand with everything we have. Now, that could just be even in our money. It could be in our talents, in our gifts, in our time. It could be just even in the, hey, I have this tool and I'm being willing to share it. I saw on Facebook that somebody said, hey, I have a rototiller, and put it in a Facebook group. If anybody wants a garden, come and borrow it. That's being generous with your stuff. And there's that kind of perspective that we can have. And this is really what God is calling us to do, that we realize that everything we have is a gift from God and that we are generous with it, that we don't hold it tightly, but rather we have an open hand with it, that we understand that we are stewards. It is our job to take care of it and to use it to the best of our abilities. Now, the question that people ask about this, because the word comes up, is do Christians have to tithe? Now, the argument is, there's a couple arguments that are made here. One is that Christ fulfilled the Old Testament law. He says it right there in Matthew 5, verse 17. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And so we don't wear Jewish garb or Jewish customs. I get to eat bacon, thankfully, and eat pork and those kind of things. All those laws are no longer part of the system. They figured that out in Acts 15. And so some people will argue, well, because that's an Old Testament concept, then we don't need to give. Well, one, I'll argue that if you look at all the ways that the Israelites were called to give, it was actually more than a tenth. It was probably closer to over 20%. But that's regardless. The question is should we give that or not? And I would say in some senses that there's no law that says you should give. There's no New Testament passage that says you and I need to give a tenth of what we own and that is something that we need to follow. However, Jesus does not dismiss the tithe, but rather warns against using it in a legalistic way. He brings a challenge to the religious people of his day, the Pharisees, who are literally giving a tenth and then ignoring the poor person next to them. And they're saying, well, it's because I've given my tenth, I can ignore this thing and I can do whatever I want. And they're puffing themselves up because of it. They were bragging about how they don't just give a tenth of their money, they give a tenth of everything, including their herbs and their garden and all this stuff. And you'll see that Jesus doesn't dismiss the tithe, but he does get the attitude underneath it, which is, I'm better than you because I'm doing this. And so he doesn't dismiss it, but he does warn against using it in a legalistic way. We also see that Paul encourages believers to give in proportion to their means. When he is collecting an offering, he says, on the first day of every week, each of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up so that when I come, no collection will have to be made. And I think that we see that there is this idea that we can give in proportion to our means. And so some people have been given lots and they have the freedom. More of their needs are met. And so they can give generously. Others are barely scraping to make their ends meet. But still, there's a request that they give. That's what Paul implies here. The other thing that we see is that Paul implies that church members should continue to support the ministry of the church. I know this sermon's a little you provide my salary and those kind of things, but it is a biblical thing. 1 Timothy says that the elders who direct the affairs of the church are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. And then it says that the worker deserves his wage. Now, there are actually churches in our community that say that a pastor should never receive a salary. But that's not what we see. And so we see that there is this idea of giving to the church is a New Testament concept. Galatians 6 says, nevertheless, the one who receives instruction in the word should share all good things with their instructor. And so we see that this idea of giving and supporting those who work and not in ministry, either in the church or outside of it, that's our responsibility. But we also see that there is also an urge to be cheerfully meet the needs of others. In 2 Corinthians 9, he says it right there. He says that God desires each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. But the giving that he's having is not for the church, it's actually for the poor people, and that's what he's asking them to give. And so we see that both of these things, the giving to the church, the giving to take care of the needy, are things that are repeated in the New Testament, and so it's good for us to give. And so I would say it this way. While there's no definitive command in the New Testament to give a certain percentage of our income, there is an assumption that giving proportionally to our income should be a regular part of our lives, and that this generosity should go help support the work of the church and other charitable organizations that do the work of God. And that is helping to take care of the poor, helping to spread his mission, and other things like that. And so if we are giving to those are the kinds of things that we should give. And it should be in proportion to our income. And I think a tithe is a good thing to shoot for. And so if we aren't in that spot where we're not giving at all, maybe the challenge is that we start giving something, that we give something and begin in that process. For others of us, maybe we look at it and we say, hey, I can give, this is what I'm giving. And maybe that's what used to be where my means are, and now I've gone and I can give more. Again, it's not just to the church, it's outside of the church as well. But there are all kinds of needs, and we as the people of God have the ability to help them and help fulfill them. And if we don't hold our money tightly, but rather we view ourselves as stewards, then we'll give freely to that. And I want us to see that God invites us to receive the blessing that comes from storing our treasures in him. Matthew 6:19 says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasure in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart also will be. And I think that's why God is speaking so bluntly to the people in Malachi's day. In their pocketbooks, they were showing that they put their hope and trust and their heart towards other things. I want you to think about this. Again, that quote that I sent in the very beginning, our bank accounts, whether we like it or not, those things that we can spend money on, show those areas that we have our heart in. Why do you think when two people get married, you fight about money? I will never forget when I was a youth pastor where I brought in different couples. And one of my friends, he was actually my former boss, who was an engineer, he and his wife came and he said, he talked about giving in an allowance where each spouse got a certain amount of money that they could spend whatever they wanted on. And he made a comment, he said, the reason why we do this is because when we had no money, we didn't argue because we knew all where it was all going to go. But he said, once we had extra money, then I wanted to spend it on this, and my wife wanted to spend it on this, and we made this judgment because we thought that was ridiculous, and she thought mine was ridiculous. She wanted to buy it on home decor, and I wanted to buy it on robotics or board games or whatever it was. And they would fight over it because their heart was for those things. And he said, finally, the way that they dealt with it is everybody got $50 or $100 a month, and you could spend it on whatever you wanted. And they couldn't say anything, and that's how they dealt with it. But the idea behind it is what got me interested. I was a single guy at the time. It is that idea that when we have discretionary income and when we have those kind of things, those conflicts happen because we have different wants or desires, and those things that draw our hearts are the things that we want to easily spend it on. I have no problems buying tools. I have no problems buying those kind of things. But, new curtains. Because that's where my heart is. That's what I'm passionate about. And I can give you all the reasons why I need that tool. I'm sure somebody who wants new curtains could give all kinds of reasons for curtains or whatever it is. But if we are honest, those things that we can easily give our money to are the things that can easily control our hearts. And I think what this passage should challenge us is, or what are those things that easily control our hearts? Are we easily giving the money to God and thankfully and generously giving it to Him, or are we doing it begrudgingly because it doesn't get what we want? It keeps us from getting the things that we want. And we have to ask ourselves those hard questions like, why is it that those things have a control over me? What is it about the tools why do I want it? Well, I mean, maybe it's that building stuff gives me pleasure, or maybe it gives me a sense of accomplishment. Those aren't bad things. Maybe, though, it's because I'm building my self-worth on my ability to do something, or might be a ability to create more than I would care to admit. And we have to ask those questions. Maybe we are buying things because we feel bad about ourselves, and we think that if we have just the right clothes or just the right car or the perfect house, then maybe people will think differently about us. Even saving, it's good for us to save. I mean, there's all kind of proverbs that say, hey, you need to save money. But if we only are so worried about saving and that we aren't willing to give, I think it shows a lack of trust in God. Ultimately, where we're at is we're storing for ourselves up because we don't trust that He's going to provide for us. And it's a difficult thing for us to trust that He will. Giving requires sacrifice. It means that we may not live the way that we could. And that we maybe the way that other people around us. We may not have the newest car. We may not get to go on different vacations or those kind of things like we should if we're giving faithfully. Now, it doesn't mean that if you go on vacation or you have a new car, that's a bad thing if you're giving within your means. I always tell the story. When I first met Steph's parents, I saw that they had a Jaguar, or grandparents, they had a Jaguar. And I remember my first reaction was, whoa. And there's judgment. It was a nice Jaguar. Do you know who's the most generous person I know on this planet? Her grandparents. Their Jaguar was just because her grandma had to use the bathroom, and a salesman got him. The Jaguar dealership was the one place that had a bathroom on their way there, and so they stopped in, and a Jaguar salesman convinced them to buy a car. But I can tell you that there was no people who sacrificed because they bought that Jaguar. Matter of fact, they gave so much money that I think people would be shocked at the amount of money that they gave. And they're one of the reasons why Crossway Church is even the way that Crossway Church is. We can talk about it because they both have died. They wouldn't even want you to know that. It's not about what you have or what you've been given or what the possessions that you have, but rather what's your attitude towards it. And are we as generous as we could be? That is really the question. Now, what motivates us for generosity, and I think the Bible is absolutely clear, is that Christ's generosity towards us should motivate us to give. Jesus gave us sacrificially for us, and that's why we want to give. Our giving is a grateful response. When we are in a good head place, when we realize that everything that we've been given is a gift from God, and we don't want to hold it tightly, when we don't let those things that could easily consume us and dictate that, control us more, what we have is this attitude of like, man, God has been so gracious to me. He's given me all this stuff. He's given me even more than that. He's given me grace. And so the least I can do is give Him a portion of my giving, of what He's given me. That's what God desires. Not, I have to give, I hate giving, I'm going to give that check, although sometimes it may feel like that. But when we feel that, I think it's good for us to remember what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 8. I'm not commanding you, but I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. And what he's talking about is also talked about in Philippians 2, where it says he had all the gloriousness of heaven, the riches, everything at his hand, and yet he gave it up willfully and took on human form. And he did it because he knew that was the only way that you and I could have salvation. That was the only hope that we could have, because our sin separated us from God. And so he gave up everything he had and took on human form. And he became a human and he lived a sinless life. And in that life, he had all kinds of difficult things happen to us, including a trial. And he was crucified on our behalf. And the cross is horrendous enough. But on that cross, he also suffered the wrath of God. And in that moment, he paid the price for you and I. And so what Paul says is, Christ had everything and he gave it up willfully for you and I. And when that impacts us, when we realize that everything we have is a gift from God, and also the grace that we have is a gift from God, and when we're overwhelmed by that, then we don't hold to things tightly, and we will give generously. We will give generously because we know that it's a response of gratitude to what God has given us. And that's our goal. The goal of this sermon is not just to give you to give, but rather for us to realize that everything we have is a gift. And that God has been faithful to us, and he's been generous to us. And we need to be reminded of that. And when we understand that, then we can be in a place to give. And so we got to ask ourselves, if giving isn't part of our work, and I want to tell you, I don't know who gives anything in this church. The only people who know who gives is our deacons and our treasurer. None of the elders specifically know, because we don't want it to have any kind of an effect on anything we do. But I do want you to know that I know that there's some of you who are very generous in this church, and I want to say thank you for that. And this church survives because of your generosity, and I know that you're not just generous here, you're generous to other people. Young Life in Battleground, who I should have prayed for, I knew I was forgetting something. They were at a camp this weekend. That's where they're at. I knew I was forgetting a prayer request. You're being generous to them. Some of you are being generous to the food bank. You're being generous to all these different things. That's a good thing. And I want to thank you for that. But it begins by understanding the gospel. Understanding the gospel. That everything we have is a gift, including the grace that Jesus gave us. And when we understand the enormity of the gift that God has given us and the enormity of what he's done for us, then it creates this ability in our hearts not to be stingy and to hold things tightly, but rather have open hands and be gracious in what we do and what we give. Grace giving flows from the understanding of the gospel, not an obligation. And to be honest with you, I think that's one of the reasons why maybe the tithe isn't stated in that way. Instead, what's reminded over and over in the New Testament is we give because God gave us. We give out of generosity. We give because God has given to us. And we are thankful for what he's done. So I encourage you this week just to think about this. Where are you at in your giving? And if it's hard to give, maybe part of what we start in is, where are we at in our gratitude? Are we focused so much on the things that we don't have that maybe we need to ask ourselves, Lord, just reveal in me this heart of gratitude for everything for you've done. For those of you who have been generous with your gifts, thank you for that. But thank you also, but make sure that we keep that attitude of not begrudgingly, but rather out of gratitude. When we write that check or we send whatever, that's the attitude that we have, because that's the heart that God desires, a heart fully devoted to him. Let's pray.
You have just watched a sermon from Crossway Church in Battleground, Washington. We hope that you enjoyed it, and we'd love to have you come join us for a worship service on Sunday at 10 a.m. at 311 North Parkway Avenue in Battleground, Washington. If you'd like to find more information about us online, you can find it at crosswaychurchwa.com.